I will say before we get started, because you might not be able to pick this up at first, but I will say right up front that I oppose critical theory. Okay, I stand against critical theory, but I find that it's difficult to understand. It's been difficult for me to understand, and I find that for a lot of Christians, they have a sense or an intuition that it's wrong. Right? They have a sense or an intuition that there's something not right about it, but it can be difficult to put your finger on exactly where it is mistaken. And so I've put together a way that I think is helpful to explain and understand what's going on in critical theory, what it is and why it's wrong. So let me start with this explanation of what critical theory is, and then we'll go into more of how to engage it, how we can stand against it, okay? So in my explanation of critical theory, I want you to think about this question for just a few seconds. I'm just going to give you 10, 15 seconds to think about it. But think about this question in your own life. What is your view of motorcycles? What's your view of motorcycles? Now, I'm not going to take the time to poll or have you raise your hand and tell me what your view of motorcycles is, but I would imagine across our country or across our society, if we polled people or just had conversations with people, we would discover that there are several different views of motorcycles. Maybe even in this room we have different views of motorcycles. So just for hypothetical purposes, let's narrow it down to merely 5 views of motorcycles. Okay, let's say there are some people who have a negative view of motorcycles. They find them to be dangerous. Maybe somebody lost their son or daughter in a motorcycle accident. And so they have a very negative view of motorcycles and would like to see them illegal, outlawed. Maybe somebody else has a positive view of motorcycles. Maybe they grew up on a farm and they use motorcycles like as a recreational vehicle for fun with their family, and so they have a very positive view of motorcycles, and they like motorcycles, and they would not want to see them be outlawed. We can just speculate here. There's probably a view of motorcycles that's negative because it's associated with gangs. Right? Let's say hypothetically that there's a family who was run down by a motorcycle gang and abused in a very bad way. And so they, from their experience, have a very negative view of motorcycles because they associate it with dangerous gangs. And so they would similarly probably agree with this group that they should be outlawed, illegal. Maybe there's another group of people who used motorcycles in World War II. You know, that was a very common thing. Motorcycles were used to fight the war, and a lot of guys, when they came back from the war, just enjoyed their motorcycles so much, and that's a lot of the reason why motorcycles became so popular in the 40s and 50s and 60s, because the guys came home from the war wanting to work, continue to work, and improve their motorcycle. So let's say there's folks out there who have a very positive view of motorcycles because they associate it with the war and being a hero in the war. As I said, I'm sure there's tons and tons of different views of motorcycles out there, but let's just look at one more. Let's say that there are wives who are very frustrated with their husbands because they waste too much money on motorcycles. Let's say that they're avid motorcycle enthusiasts and they buy too many, and in all seriousness, maybe they spend so much on their motorcycle hobby that they don't have enough money left over for food or providing for their own children. So you can understand how a spouse would be frustrated and angry at that. So they would have a negative view of motorcycles. So we could go on and on. As you can imagine, there's lots of different views of motorcycles out there. But let's say that each group then is arguing for their particular view. They're advocating for their view, thinking that their view is right, and therefore they try to convince others of their view. So, for example, those who think motorcycles are just too dangerous to be allowed out there on the streets, they would be having conferences, they would be trying to do things to convince others of their view, maybe even trying to build thought structures, trying to impose their view on others because they're convinced that motorcycles are dangerous. They would use social pressure, rhetoric, laws. They might even try to work in the structures of society to pass laws against motorcycles, or if they couldn't do that, at least provide through the law, through society, privileges to those who don't have motorcycles. So maybe tax breaks, maybe all sorts of advantages or privileges for those who don't have motorcycles, in a sense to punish or make it difficult for those who do like to own motorcycles. Well, let's say one group, let's just say this group here in the middle, the group that's against motorcycles because they associate it with gangs, let's say that they grow in their influence to such a degree that they're able to really dominate the other views. It might not become the majority view in society, but let's say that they're able to, through this pressure, through laws, to make their view the normal view, the accepted view. And so then you have politicians, you have laws, city, state, federal laws that advantage people without motorcycles and possibly even get to the point where they outlaw motorcycles. I have to ask then, how would you feel, let's say you are, and I'm sure most of you are like this in the room, like motorcycles or have at least a positive view of motorcycles, how would you feel in this situation? How would you respond if this particular view grew to such a degree that it pushed out the other views and was imposed on you? Well, I don't think you would like it very much. I wouldn't like it. We have a motorcycle in our family, and it's a lot of fun, and we enjoy it. And so I think our family would be frustrated by that somebody else's view of motorcycles was being pushed or imposed on me. I would find that to be frustrating, and I'm sure you would too. Well, critical theory at its root is trying to understand these group dynamics. So you could call this situation, as critical theorists would try to understand the power dynamics between these different groups, between these different views. This could even be called critical motorcycle theory, because they're trying to understand how these groups are vying for power and influence in society. Each group has their different view, and they're trying to establish their view as the normal, accepted view. So critical theory, at the root of it, is merely trying to understand these different dynamics, these power dynamics, as each group tries to enforce their view on others. Not only understand it, though, it's one thing to understand it, but what critical theory goes beyond merely trying to understand these group dynamics, these power struggles, they go beyond that and they try to protect the smaller groups from being dominated by the larger, more powerful groups. So besides just understanding it, they want to protect the smaller views, or the oppressed views, if you will. So critical theorists are not only trying to understand these things, but also work to prevent one view to override and dominate the other views. This is one of the reasons why critical theorists celebrate diversity. Because they understand in diversity, if there's several different views out there, and diversity of views is celebrated and encouraged, then that helps prevent any one view from becoming too powerful. So that's one of the reasons you'll see critical theorists talk about and celebrate diversity so much. They'll use examples like the Nazi view of Jews. So in the 20s and 30s in Germany, there was lots of different views, obviously, of Jewish people, but the Nazi view of the Nazi view of Jewish people grew and became the dominant view. And critical theorists would say one of the reasons that happened was there wasn't enough diversity, or diversity wasn't encouraged, such that the Nazi view grew and dominated and pushed out the other views. So that's one of the reasons you'll see critical theorists celebrate diversity. Maintaining diversity prevents that. So critical theory at its root then can be used to study any topic, any situation where there's different groups of people who have different views vying for power or influence, trying to impose their view on others. So let's just run down some other issues, some other topics where critical theory could be used to study the power dynamics of different groups. So for example, there could be, and I'm sure there is, critical alcohol theory. I'm sure if we did the same thing in this room, there'd be different views of alcohol in this room, in this church, in society. So whose view gets established as the norm? We went through the motorcycle theory kind of as a hypothetical, but this is what actually happened during Prohibition, right? The view that alcohol is bad and evil and should be outlawed became the norm, and that group with that particular view got enough power and influence to outlaw alcohol. Didn't work out very well, but that's what happened. And so critical alcohol theory would be studying those dynamics and how that particular group came to power and influence, and then imposed their view through the structures of society, laws, and social pressure, and people's thinking, their thought structure. You could use critical theory to evaluate guns, right? Different views of guns and how these different views are vying for influence and power in a society. Critical sex theory, critical marriage theory. There's different views of marriage out there. Will Smith, the famous actor, came out recently and said that he had felt oppressed growing up in a Christian environment, being taught, marriage is supposed to be monogamous for life, and how that was oppressive for him, and now he's been exposed to other views of marriage, and came out this summer and said that him and his wife have been operating in an open marriage. So there's different views of marriage. How does one particular view of marriage become dominant or the norm in a society as these different views vie for power and influence? You can have critical government theory, different views on the role of government. You could have critical mask mandate theory. No, I'm serious. We just experienced this in our church, right? There are different views about masks at this church. Different groups, right? Different views, discussing, disagreeing. Which view do we go with? Those sort of power dynamics and influence dynamics can be studied. That's what critical theorists do. Similarly, critical vaccinations theory, on and on. Anytime there's an issue or a topic, critical gender theory, what's the role of women? What's the role of genders, right? And then the one that we're most familiar with, that hits the news most often, is critical race theory. Different views of race vying for influence and control, making their view the normal view. A big part of critical theory is that critical theorists would say that people develop their view from their lived experience, from the experience that they've gone through in their life. So that's why when I laid out this example, I talked about the different folks and their backgrounds and how maybe if they experienced their son or daughter dying in a motorcycle accident, that is what led them to their view of motorcycles, war, gang violence, so on and so forth. So they make a big deal about lived experience because that's what they would say your view comes from. Now, it's important to understand that critical theory says that none of these views are objectively true. This is going to be a big part of the critique when we get to that stage and we're critiquing critical theory. But they hold that none of these views are correct. There isn't a correct view. There's not an objectively true view. There's just different perspectives, just different opinions. So it's very closely tied to the idea of relative truth, relative subjective truth. Nobody knows objective reality. All we have are our different views of it. Views can't be right or wrong, correct or incorrect, true or false. Views are just different opinions. Now, another big part of critical theory is that they would say that when a group becomes the dominant view, when a group gets their view to be the norm, the accepted one, then this power that they have now, that they've gained in trying to enforce their view, this power corrupts them. They are corrupted by this power that they have. So maybe use the critical alcohol theory as a good example, since that actually did happen in history. So critical theorists would say that particular group who got their view of alcohol, that it's bad, evil, should be outlawed, should be made illegal, when they got the power to enforce their view, that power went to their head and it corrupted their ability to understand the issue. And, let's be honest, it does feel good when your view is the dominant view, right? When you get to impose your view, when the vast majority of people, the government, whoever, agrees that your view is the correct view, that does feel good, right? It feels good that when your view is established as the right view and people buy into it, that gives you good feels. Whether it's masks, whether it's vaccinations, when your view is the one that gets established as the correct one, that's a good feeling. Well, according to critical theory, when a group gets that sort of power and influence, it blinds them from understanding other groups' perspectives. So they begin to see other groups as a threat to their power, a threat to their ability to enforce their view on society. And so they resist these other groups and fight against these other groups to maintain control of their position, to enforce their perspective. So they end up villainizing these other groups. They make them look bad. They use rhetoric, propaganda, name-calling, labeling to try to diminish and push down these other groups because they want to maintain the power to enforce their perspective. Again, at this point, I'm just trying to explain critical theory so you know where it comes from and what it's all about, and then we're going to start critiquing it. So according to critical theory, then, when the view that gets the power to enforce and impose their view on others, their perception becomes distorted. They don't see reality as clearly as the other groups because they're corrupted and influenced by the power that they've developed for themselves. So, last couple things about critical theory. So, critical theorists would say that if the group in power claims to have reasons and evidence for their view, let's say, the group in power tries to put forth these research studies and say, look, motorcycles should be made illegal, and here's all the evidence why. Maybe they would give evidence in terms of crash statistics, death statistics, how much they're associated with gangs. If the group in power would try to use reason, rationality, evidence, then critical theorists would say what they're actually doing is just making bids for power. It's just a power play. You can dismiss all of their reasons, you can dismiss all of their evidence, because their real motive is just to continue to maintain power so that they can impose their view on others. You don't have to listen to their evidence. You don't have to listen to their reason. That's not where truth is. Truth comes more from your lived experience. You can dismiss all their reason and evidence because that's merely power plays to stay in control of society and impose their view on others. So you can see, with a little bit of this background now, you can see how most critical theorists understand Christianity, right? So to critical theorists, Christianity is just one view trying to vie for power, trying to vie for influence in society so that they can make their view the standard view. Whether it's, the Christian view of marriage, the Christian view of homosexuality, whatever the Christian view is on any topic, alcohol, they see Christians as just one of these groups that's vying for influence so that they can impose their view on others. And of course, they find that to be very oppressive. Why should I have to follow your view of marriage? Why should your view of marriage be the one that's enforced through the tax code, through laws, so on and so forth? Just how you would feel, right, if this group with this view of motorcycles would impose their view of motorcycles on you and made them illegal. That's the sort of feeling that these folks get when they see or think of Christians. So we have to be aware of that, be aware of how they think so that we can lovingly critique them and point out where their thinking has gone wrong. So the next thing I want to do, and really for the rest of the time, is I want to show you how we can engage critical theory in a loving, respectful way. And so I'm going to provide two critiques of critical theory, and then I'm going to give some suggestions here about how we can avoid being influenced by the thinking of critical theory. Because it's insipid. Sometimes we don't even realize, and I think you'll see this as we go through it, we don't even realize that we've picked up on some of the thinking, we've been influenced by it without even realizing it. And this happens just being part of a culture. The messages are communicated through art, movies, TV, radio, literature, and we pick up on these ideas and embrace them without even realizing that we've done it. And so we just have to be aware and resist being influenced by this incorrect thinking. So let me go through the problems with critical theory, just two of them for now. The first one is that critical theory is self-defeating. Critical theory itself is self-defeating because it says all of your truth claims are strategic attempts at power to impose your view. However, think about it for a moment. Critical theorists claim that critical theory is true. But if truth claims really are, according to critical theory, strategic attempts at power, then aren't the truth claims of critical theory also strategic attempts at power? Aren't critical theorists doing the exact same thing that they're critiquing others of doing? That is, they have a view, they have a perspective, and they're trying to push their perspective, push their view on others, to get others to think the way that they do. Thus, according to their own theory, they're being oppressive. According to their own theory, they're doing the same evil thing, according to their theory, that they accuse others of. So here's how I would respond to this conundrum. Here's how I would respond to the fact that critical theory is self-defeating. I would say, let's just all be honest and admit we take different positions on things. Okay, whether it's alcohol, whether it's the mask mandate, whether it's motorcycles, whether it's marriage, let's just be honest and say, hey, we've got a certain position or belief on this issue, and we think that our position is true. We think that our beliefs on this particular issue is true. And then recognize that it is perfectly acceptable to try to convince others that your position is correct. I mean, that's what we do. That's just part of being human. We disagree, we have differences. Let's just be open and honest about that and admit, hey, yeah, I think you're wrong, and I'm going to try to convince you that you're wrong. It doesn't mean that you're a jerk. That's just how we interact. Of course, I would affirm that we should never try to force our view on others, whatever our view is, whatever our position is, whether it's religion, politics, marriage. We should never try to force our view on others. Instead, we should try to make our case respectfully, providing reasons, evidence, good arguments with patience, love, and respect. So I would be very much against any sort of ad hominem arguments. And this is what you often see in critical theory, is not dealing with the arguments and the evidence in a reasonable, rational way, but it's attacking people's motives. So for example, going back to the critical motorcycle theory, when that view would present reasons and evidence for their position, critical theory would say you can dismiss all that because they would look merely at their motives, deconstruct the situation, and just say you can dismiss all the reasons and evidence because their motives are really just for power. And that's a fallacy. It's an ad hominem fallacy where you're attacking the person and their motives instead of the reasons and evidence that they're providing. And that's just disrespectful. No, I think we should take the best arguments of whatever we're opposing, whether it's same-sex marriage or critical theory, take their best arguments and work through them and point out where they're wrong, not just attack their motives. So the second critique I'm going to offer is that critical theory is inconsistent. It's inconsistent. Because on one hand, critical theory says that no one view on any issue should dominate and be imposed on others. We talked about this. Remember, it seems to promote relativism. Relativism when it comes to truth or morality. It seems to promote moral relativism, truth relativism. That there isn't any truth with a capital T. All that we have in society are different views and perspectives. And none of them are right or correct. They're just different views. No one view is correct or true. However, that's what they seem to say on one hand, but they just can't avoid taking certain positions on things. So inconsistently, they do take positions on certain moral issues. And you know what these issues are, right? They take moral issues like racism, and then they take a position on it and advocate for their position as though it is the correct position. That racism is wrong, that Nazism is wrong, that rape is wrong, and that it's appropriate to take those views and make them the norm in a society, that rape is wrong or that racism is wrong. So even though they seem to advocate for moral relativism, truth relativism, they can't but help making a case and implicitly advocating for moral realism, that there are objective moral truths. So implicitly, when they take these stands, they're admitting that moral relativism is false, that there are objective moral truths. The problem, and here's my response to this issue, the problem is that critical theory does not have an objective moral standard to determine which moral views have objective truth, right? They say that there are some issues where there is objective moral truth. Like I said, rape is wrong, Nazism is wrong, racism is wrong. But they say that there are other views where there is no objective moral truth. Maybe views on marriage, sex, gender roles. There they would say there's just different views. There's no objective truth. But the problem is they don't have any sort of foundation or good explanation as to why there is objective moral truth in some areas and not in others. Critical theory just does not have a good explanation of how objective moral truth could exist apart from our various views and opinions. Especially if a critical theorist would affirm materialism or naturalism, that all that exists is the material physical universe, then there really is no way for them to take an objective moral stand, because in such a situation all we have are our different views. And there's no external measurement to tell us which views are right, which views are wrong. All we have are our subjective views in such a scenario. Well, this leads into, as you probably know where I'm going with this leads into the moral argument for God. This is the area of ministry and apologetics that I specialize in. And so the moral argument, I think, is very useful in this conversation with critical theorists, because they seem to, even though sometimes they will say that they affirm moral relativism, they can't but help themselves to take objective moral stands on some issues, like racism is wrong. And so they seem to affirm this first premise, that there are some objective moral truths. But, and this is where I specialize, this is where I've spent the last 7 or 8 years fighting for this premise, writing, researching, discussing this premise, that God, the existence of God, is the best explanation of how and why there can be objective moral truths to begin with. So if somebody grants the first premise, then we can spend some good time conversing with them about this second premise. Okay, if there are these objective moral truths out there, rape is wrong, racism is wrong, then where do those moral truths come from? They can't come from us, because that would lead us back to moral relativism, moral subjectivism, that morality just comes from us and we just have our different views and that's all we got. We're just stuck there. But no, if there is objective moral truth, then we can talk about where they come from. We'll take some questions and stuff at the end, but let me finish running through the material here. Okay, let me move into the last section then, and that is how to avoid being influenced by critical thinking. Avoid being influenced by their thinking, and a large part of that has to do with even their language. If we're not careful, we can pick up on their language, and language is influential. Even using their language can help put us into the mindset of thinking in critical theory ways. So my first advice in avoiding being influenced by critical theory is not to look down on human reason, not to look down on our God-given human reason. We talked about this a little bit already, but I'll give you some quotes. Critical theory, for the most part, looks down on human reason. It villainizes reason and rationality. So here's some quotes from well-known critical theorists. The first one: the idea that objectivity is best reached only through rational thought is a specifically Western and masculine way of thinking. So you got these different vying for views, right? Well, one view says reason and rationality is the correct way to get at truth. Another group says no, lived experience or embodied experience is the best way to get at truth. Different views vying for power. And they say that the view of reason and rationality, that that's the best way to get at truth, is merely the masculine view or the Western view. And there's other views of how we can know truth out there that don't elevate reason and rationality. So the second quote: within the Western context, knowledge was traditionally defined as that information gained through reason, discovering truth and reality through the rational method, impartiality, detachment, objectivity. Typically men, then, were the only legitimate holders of knowledge. But feminists and phenomenologists have suggested that knowing can be based upon lived experience. From lived experience, knowledge could be constructed by individuals and communities rather than being universal and resulting strictly from rational argument. So critical theory has a very negative view, just like some people have a negative view of motorcycles. Most critical theorists have a negative view of reason and rationality. As we've discussed, when you request sometimes if you're talking to somebody who holds to critical theory and you ask for reasons for their position or give me evidence that your position is true, they'll just dismiss that and they'll see that as a way to dismiss people's lived experiences. They'll say things like, look, the oppressed person doesn't need evidence or arguments to obtain knowledge about oppression because they've lived it. They've experienced oppression. So that lived experience has given them knowledge, not reason and evidence. Reason and evidence is just a Western way of thinking, a masculine way of thinking. Now, unfortunately, and why I'm trying to encourage you not to be influenced by this, is that I also see a similar attitude against reason found in the church. I find that there's a lot of Christians who also have a negative view of our God-given reason and rationality. I'll give you an example of this. Here's a book, and I'll pass it around so you can take a look at it. This is a book by a Christian professor, James K. Smith, who's afraid of postmodernism. And basically what he's saying is you shouldn't be afraid of postmodernism, because postmodernism has a low view of reason and rationality, and that's a good thing. We also, as Christians, should not have a positive view of reason and rationality. So here's an example of a Christian thinker, a professor at one of our Christian schools, having a similar anti-reason attitude that I think we really need to avoid. Now, this is part and parcel of postmodernism, and postmodernism, as I understand it, is just a series of movements in the last 200 years that are responding to modernism and, in a sense, overreacting to modernism. So if you've taken my philosophy course, you'll know that I walk through, Western thinking and try to explain that in the modern era, think of the Enlightenment, 1700s, scientific revolution, in the modern era, we elevated reason too highly, okay? But in the postmodern movement, the postmodern movements of the 1800s and the 1900s, we overreacted to that and now look down too much at reason and rationality. We don't want to make either mistake. We don't want to elevate reason, human reason, too highly, but we also don't want to look down too much on our God-given reason and rationality. So I would make the case that truth does not come from our feelings, truth does not come from inside of us, and truth does not come from our lived experiences. I would take the position and argue that truth comes from God, that ultimately truth is revealed to us by God through His creation and Scripture. Sometimes you hear theologians talk about general revelation and special revelation. General revelation being creation, nature, if you will. Special revelation being the Bible, Scripture, God speaking to us directly. Both forms, though, are revelation from God. The thing is, we use our God-given reason and rationality to interpret and understand both revelations. So when we study Scripture, we use our reason and rationality. We use grammar to understand how sentences are laid out. We use our reason and rationality when we do systematic theology to bring different verses together, using logic and reason and rationality to understand what God is communicating to us. So we don't want to have too negative a view of our God-given reason and rationality. And if we're not careful, we can be influenced by critical theory to think negatively about our reason and rationality. The next piece of advice that I would give is that we shouldn't use critical theory terms. Remember, within critical theory, they claim that there is no objective truth, there's just different views. And views aren't true or false, they're just opinions. Kind of like your favorite flavor of ice cream, right? You might say, well, I think chocolate is best, or I think vanilla is best, or you might be crazy and say that pistachio is the best ice cream, right? According to critical theory, that's all we have. We just have different views. So when we use these terms, this is why we have to be so careful with how we communicate. with the world, because we will have a message for the world, and we want to articulate and communicate our message in a way that they can understand what we're saying. The problem is when we use some of their terms like, well, from a Christian perspective, XYZ, or according to the Christian view of things, ABC. Or when we even use the term, and I know this is a popular term, but I think we need to break ourselves from it. When we use the term Christian worldview, we're using their language. We're in a sense saying that, hey, the things that we believe, hey, that's just our view. That's just our perspective on abortion, same-sex marriage, whatever we're talking about. If we just qualify ourselves by saying that that's our view, that's how we view the world, then we're playing right into critical theory, because that's what they're saying. All there are views. Views are just opinions. They're not right or wrong. But no, I think we need to be more careful and explain, look, I don't believe Christianity is merely my view. I actually believe that Christianity is objectively true. That it's true not just in my view of things, but it's true in reality. And I know that sounds weird for me to have to articulate so carefully, but if we don't do that, they've bought into this way of thinking of just subjective views and opinions, that if we use their terms, it's like an echo. They're just going to hear how they understand these terms. And if we qualify ourselves by saying, well, it's just our view, then it's just going to fit into their thinking that there is no objective truth. There's just different views of reality. So I try to be very, very careful in how I communicate my Christian beliefs, because I want to communicate them in such a way that they know I'm talking about something that can be true or false. I want them to know that I'm not just expressing my feelings or my opinion or my view, that I'm making propositional statements about reality that can be true or false. You see the two different categories? I think this is a good way to understand it. So, which belief is more similar to our belief about Christianity? Is it more similar to this statement, or is it more similar to this statement? So when I say Christianity is true, or I believe in Christianity, am I saying it more in this category of thinking or in this category of thinking? Because when we use terms like from a Christian perspective or from a Christian worldview, this is what they're hearing. They're hearing that, oh, it's just your view of things. Where no, what we want to make clear is that we're making propositional statements about reality that could be true or false. More similarly to this statement, it's raining outside. That's a propositional statement about what's actually taking place out there. Now that statement could be right, it could be wrong, but at least they're understanding now what we're claiming. We're not just claiming a view, we're claiming to be making statements about reality. So oftentimes you'll hear me, I'll say things like, I believe Christianity is true, but I could be wrong. And some Christians, if they don't understand why I'm saying that, they get very uncomfortable and say, well, why would you qualify yourself like that? And I try to explain, I'm saying language like that to help people in our culture realize that I'm making these type of claims, not these type of claims. So I try to say things like, well, if Christianity is true, and I believe it is, then abortion is wrong. I don't say things like, well, from a Christian worldview, abortion is wrong. Because again, you're playing into their thinking when you're using their terms. So I say things like, I believe Christianity is objectively true. Francis Schaeffer even ran into this problem in the 60s and 70s, where people were confusing him in this regard. So he started using the term true truth. What I'm telling you is true truth. But I think we can even go beyond that and explain what we mean, that we're making objective truth claims, not just sharing our view of things. And then go on to give reasons and evidence for why we think Christianity is true. Okay, the last piece of advice that I have is just more practical. And this can be used in any conversation where you disagree with someone. And this is just to be very careful on how you disagree with someone. So these are my 10 don'ts. Don't build a straw man. I trust you know what a straw man is, that when you engage with somebody you disagree with and you take, let's say, their worst arguments or their silly arguments and or even just create arguments that they don't really hold to, so you build this straw man. It's kind of like go back to the Middle Ages where you've got knights fighting each other, and sometimes to practice being a knight, right, you would build a man out of straw so you can go and defeat that scarecrow more easily just for practice. So you build a straw man because it's easier to defeat. Well, we don't want to do that with our opponents. No, we want to take their best arguments and work through them and point out where they're wrong, not their worst arguments, or just create an opponent that doesn't even actually exist. I would also say not to oversimplify. I know sometimes we only have a few minutes to explain things, and so we have to overgeneralize. I mean, I've even overgeneralized and oversimplified this morning just for the sake of time. But be careful when you do that, because you might end up exaggerating or describing them in a way that's not actually true. We don't want to play their games, in other words. We don't want to use propaganda and rhetoric. We want to be honest and fair with our opponents. We don't want to attack motives, right? We don't want to just dismiss their arguments or their reasons and evidence because we think they're just doing it for some ill motive. They might very well be doing it for ill motives. We don't know. But that's not the level of where we should engage. We should engage with their reasons and evidence, their arguments, not their motives. Don't use rhetoric. Don't resort to name calling. Oh, I find this, as you know, on the internet so much from both sides. You hear things like, people who believe in critical theory are idiots. I think we can do better than that. We're not in grade school anymore. We're not in the grade school, we're not recessed parking lot calling people poopy heads, right? Hopefully we've grown up beyond that and we can actually engage with people instead of just calling them names. Don't use sarcasm. Please don't use memes. Memes are those silly one-liners, usually with the picture, making your opponent look silly and stupid. Look, memes don't change anybody's mind. The only thing that memes do is get people on your side to chuckle a little bit. But is that really our goal? Do we just want people on our side to chuckle a little bit? No, I think what we want to do is to change people's hearts and minds. And we don't do that by making fun of people. We do that by engaging with them in a loving, respectful way. So in that sense, don't use one-liners. Don't use unwanted labels. Ask somebody how they want to be described or labeled. Do you want to be called a Nazi? Probably not. They might not want to be called Marxists. Ask them. How do you want me to describe you? How do you want me to describe your position? What would you call it? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Don't play the victim card. I find that we as Christians are playing into this way of thinking so easily, where we cry out oppression. We cry out persecution way too quickly. Is there persecution? Certainly. There are people around the world who are getting beheaded and thrown in jail for Christianity. That's real persecution. But if we have some internet trolls who are making fun of us online, that's not persecution. We shouldn't claim oppression. We shouldn't play that victim card. Everybody's playing the victim card, and we shouldn't do that. We don't want to follow the critical theory strategy. Instead, my advice here is to critique critical theory honestly, respectfully, and lovingly. This takes time. It takes work. It's not something we can do in 5 minutes with a meme. But we work through the reasons that they're presenting, we work through the evidence, so to speak, that they're presenting, and show where it's wrong. Even though this does take time and work and patience, I think this is what we're called to do. So I'll close here with just these 2 verses, and I think this is part and parcel of how we should be interacting with the world and how we disagree with them. So 2 Timothy 4, 1 through 2, Paul says, I solemnly exhort you in the presence of God and of Christ Jesus, who is to judge the living and the dead, and by his appearing in his kingdom, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, correct, rebuke, exhort, but with great patience and instruction. Do not fear their intimidation. We can be bold and confident in this. I'm not saying we should cower or step aside from the fight. We do need to be bold and confident, but we can do that without being a jerk. Do not fear their intimidation, do not be in dread, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you. But, as I've been saying, do this with gentleness and respect.